Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergate. This day, July 14th, 1948, Hubert Humphrey walks up to the podium at the Democratic National Convention and gave a speech that helped change America forever. At this point, Humphrey was the mayor of Minneapolis, and he would go on, of course, to be vice president. But at this stage, he was young, I'd say relatively low profile. And in this moment, he was on stage and began to forcefully push the Democratic Party to embrace the cause of civil rights. As he put it, it was time to, quote, get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. So let's talk about that Humphrey speech, Humphrey himself, and how those remarks did indeed push the party to adopt a civil rights plank at that convention. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Samuel G. Freedman, author and professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. He has written many, many books, and the new one, which we just learned was 8 years in the making, but the new one is Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. So, Sam, congratulations on the long slog.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being in such august company.
So Humphrey's background is super interesting. How he came to this conviction is really fascinating. We will get to that. But why don't we go right to that moment? He is walking on stage. Who invited him? Who said, let's put this mayor of Minneapolis up on stage and let him talk about this stuff?
Well, heading into the 1948 Democratic Convention, the big battle that everyone knew was going to occur was over civil rights. And you have to understand that as great a liberal as Franklin Roosevelt was, he had made what I would say is literally a devil's bargain to keep the New Deal coalition together. And that meant that in addition to the kind of people and groups you would expect to be in it, organized labor, liberal intellectuals, urban working class Jews and Catholics, he also included the wing of Southern segregationists who were the Democratic Party at that time. And in order to keep their votes on election day so we'd win their electoral votes, and in order to win their votes in Congress from their elected officials, a lot of whom had tremendous seniority and power, FDR had agreed they would never push the cause of civil rights. New Deal programs would be implemented and sometimes written in ways to give the segregationists workarounds, so the programs were never equitably shared with Black citizens in the South. And Harry Truman, although he actually early in his presidency had moved pretty boldly on civil rights, much more than FDR had ever done, heading into 48, he says, I've got to back away. I'm going to go with the FDR playbook. We're going to have this pallid, ambiguous language about civil rights in the platform, and that will allow the Southerners to, even if they hold their noses a bit, continue to vote Democrat and elect me president. And Humphrey is part of a group of liberal insurgents who can't tolerate this anymore, who partly out of the pure moral issue of civil rights and human rights, because this also, by the way, included battling against anti-Semitism as well as racism, and partly out of an understanding that in the Cold War, the United States had to represent real equality, because otherwise the Soviet Union had been very effectively saying to these decolonized countries in Asia and Africa and South America, Marxist-Leninism is human equality. Liberal democracy is hypocrisy. Just look at the segregated South in the United States. So it's partly operating on that basis, but it was totally bold and filled with risk because Truman considered Humphrey a crackpot. He used that exact words in his diary. The senators who were Truman's point people at the convention, one of them went up to Humphrey and said, if you give this speech, your career is over. And as you said, Jody, he's 37 years old. He's only held elective office for 3 years in his entire life. He's a mid-sized city mayor. And he's going to go out and try to circumvent what the president wants. And the other thing to keep in mind is when we think of a Democratic convention now, we think of a lot of delegates who are people of color. In 1948, there are probably 1,500 delegates, including the alternates. There are about 12 Black people who are delegates. So Humphrey's going to have to win on civil rights without really any Black delegates to vote for it. He's going to have to persuade an entirely white convention to defy the president and endorse civil rights. And that's what's just so, exhilarating about this moment.
And to just underscore how fraught this showdown is, I mean, there is going to be what is known as the Dixiecrat revolt.
Yes.
Those white segregationists who are the core of the party are going to temporarily leave the party, endorse another ticket, a states' rights ticket, in opposition to this civil rights plank. And we know that this story then plays out. It takes almost 20 years for there to be the final kind of showdown about civil rights in the Democratic Party. So here we are at the very beginning. You have the core power of the party, these segregationist senators really who are the core of the Democratic power. And you have this 37-year-old mayor staring them down. It's such a David and Goliath moment.
Yeah.
It is very David and Goliath. And in fact, the great liberal senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas, wrote about it in those terms later. He said, never had there been a braver David taking on a stronger Goliath. And the Dixiecrats, they were prepared for this. For months ahead, the governor of Mississippi, Fielding Wright, had been building this movement that was going to mutiny against the party. So on one hand, Fielding Wright is a delegate. He's the head of the Mississippi delegation. And on the other hand, on a parallel track, he's been building what he calls the States' Rights Democratic Party. And they've made it known. And you have to sympathize with Truman to an extent. He's got, Humphrey's insurgency on one hand. He's got the great Black civil rights and labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, leading protest marches outside Convention Hall. And then he's got the Dixiecrats saying in advance, if Truman is nominated and if there's any language about civil rights and platform, we're leaving. And they were so prepared for it, they had already reserved a bunch of railroad cars to take them straight from Philadelphia to Birmingham, Alabama, for their Dixiecrat convention, which of course is what they did. And you could say that that trip from Philadelphia to Birmingham was the first leg of the trip to Trumpville.
Wow. For me, when I look at Humphrey's speech, I'm so shocked by it. I'm like, I cannot believe he said, so the audacity, I think, in which he's speaking, like one of the lines which really resonated with me, he says, my friends, to those who say we are rushing the issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. And I'm like, oh my God. It was so good. And then just his desire to no, we need to put this out there. We need to speak plainly. We need to take this head on. He is not shying away at all. This is not sort of a speech that's very passive aggressive where you read between the lines. He is putting it out there.
No, he definitely put it out there. And, he had prepped for it his years as mayor of Minneapolis. We think of Minneapolis, notwithstanding the murder of George Floyd and the tremendous racism within the police department, which, by the way, and we can talk about it later if you want, Humphrey tried to reckon with when he was mayor. But we think of Minneapolis as this blue city. But when Humphrey became mayor, it was being written about as the most anti-Semitic city in the country. Wow. It was known as one of the most racist cities in the country. And he had to transform the political climate in Minneapolis, running as a civil rights candidate for mayor in a city where the blacks and Jews collectively made up maybe 3% of the population. So he had done this kind of bold work in Minneapolis, and I think it prepares him for the high stakes of the convention. The other thing, Kellie, I'm so glad you quoted that line, but just for fans of American rhetoric, and this is really, as John Meacham has written, one of the great political speeches in American history. Sometimes what we think is spontaneous, and Humphrey could often be spontaneous to a fault, is not spontaneous at all. There's a great account in one of David Marinus's books about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which people thought that was just something he came up with in that moment. No, Marinus writes about a speech that King had given in Detroit a few months or a year even prior, and he talked about the dream in that speech. He tried a slightly different version of it. Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer and civil rights activist, heard that speech. She's on the portico of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington. And when King starts speaking, she says, Martin, tell him about the dream. You can hear her cueing him. And similarly, Humphrey, I'd seen in previous speeches, had been working with that phrasing. The two, memorable phrases from the speech, the phrase 172 years too late, and the phrase about leaving the shadows of states' rights and walking into the rights and of human rights. He'd been playing with that verbiage in a few speeches for months ahead, trying to get it just right. And then in this speech, it's when he totally nails it.
I want you to paint a picture of how Humphrey comes to this conviction and his background. But one more question on that moment itself. I mean, did the people who were organizing the convention know that he was going to give such a memorable speech, an explosive speech, or was it kind of one of those? Because we've all been at conventions where you can tell that, like, oh, this is the speech that people are just kind of hoping will just get buried and glossed over, and they can spin after the fact in whatever way. And this speech comes out and there's no spinning it, right? It's very clearly what it is. But did that catch organizers off guard in any way?
The speech definitely, in many ways, took people by surprise. First of all, as you, as historians know, but a lot of listeners may not, the kind of prepackaged, no surprises conventions we're used to now were not typical in previous decades. And there would be battles that sometimes went on for days over who would be nominated for president, over what the platform would be, over which delegation would be seated or ousted from a convention. Several of those things were going on in 1948. And while it was known that the liberals, led by Humphrey, were going to try to push through a civil rights plank or get a vote on it, until the last minute, it wasn't sure it would happen, because just with the intricacies of parliamentary procedure, first you to try to win at the platform drafting committee level. And Humphrey speaks there and fails. And in fact, when you read the speech he gave, he loses his cool. He tries to make compromises that are ill-advised. He gets defeated anyway. And it's only because one of his allies, a former Congress member from Wisconsin named Andrew B. Miller, knows all the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure, that he finagles this way for Humphrey to be able to give a speech to the whole convention the next afternoon and get a vote by all the delegates. So only because of that, whole set of backroom maneuvers is Humphrey even allowed to speak at all. And as to what he's going to say, even though some of the phrases, as I said before, he'd used in previous speeches, he's pulling an all-nighter the night before and sleeplessly with some of his closest associates writing in the morning of the day he's going to give it. And one of the really important elements of the speech wasn't Humphrey's, although most of what's in there is very much Humphrey, but he had a close political ally named Eugenie Anderson, a Democratic activist from Minnesota who later became one of the first female ambassadors appointed by an American president. And Anderson comes up with this idea of, hey, instead of making it look like we're defying Harry Truman, even though we sort of are, let's hug him. Let's remind people he, before he backed away from his own civil rights agenda, had put it out there. So let's just say, hey, delegates, we're just congratulating President Truman on what he's done. and it was this workaround that allowed delegates to say to themselves, hey, we're only doing what President Truman was doing already. So that was another surprise. But even, I'll tell you, to the moment Humphrey's up on the platform, and there are 60 million people listening on the radio, there are 10 million watching on TV, which has just begun to carry conventions this year in 1948. Right up on the platform, Humphrey's still editing his speech and still wondering, should he even give it? He still has doubts. And the last thing is because, as I said, Humphrey could be spontaneous to a fault. He did not self-edit as a speaker. His wife, Muriel, who is one of his great political advisors, once said to him after this endless speech he made to a labor convention, Hubert, a speech need not be eternal to be immortal.
Amazing.
That's a great diss from your wife. And she was right. But at the convention, you only had 10 minutes. So as some of us who write in journalistic circles like Niki and I know, you're forced to be concise by space limit. And I think the 10-minute limit that Humphrey had also helped him be so forceful.
Boundaries are a gift to a writer.
Yes, they are.
Yes.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Well, so I am curious how Humphrey comes to this position, because it sounds like he, was mayor of a city that was known as being quite bigoted. Was he raised in a racially progressive family? How does he come to be this sort of leader on this front for the Democratic Party?
Hubert Humphrey is probably the least likely person, biographically speaking, to take on this role. You remember the great P-Funk formulation about the chocolate city and the vanilla suburbs? Mm-hmm. Well, Humphrey grew up in an incredibly vanilla place out in the eastern prairies of South Dakota, tiny little town in which everyone was a Protestant. The minorities, air quotes, were some French Canadian Catholics who lived in a town 10 miles away. And he has this amazing, almost mythologically charged experience when he's 11 years old. The first gravel road is being put in. And one of the road crews is a Black-owned company from Omaha, Nebraska. And of course, the word of these Black people showing up in a place that has never seen Blacks before makes the rounds. And Humphrey is curious and open-minded, very influenced by his rather liberal father. And he goes out by himself to meet these Black road workers and befriends them. And they befriend him. And it lasts, a week or two till the work is done and they go on to their next graveling job. But it, I think, activates something deep in him, because he would remember it decades later when he was working on his autobiography. And he's affected also by what's called the social gospel. And I think this is really important. We talk a lot in this country about the religious right, but there's always been a religious left in this country too. And the social gospel Protestants said the purpose of being a believer isn't to try to be pure and go to heaven. The purpose is to build what they called the kingdom of God on earth. And the social gospel Protestants, who later went on to make common cause with liberal Jews and liberal Catholics and with Black Protestants, they believed in labor rights. They believed in the social safety net. They believed in civil rights. And Humphrey's influenced by the social gospel from really his teenage years on. It remains a thread of his life. And then the single most transformational event of his life is the 1939-1940 academic year, when he goes to grad school at LSU, Louisiana State, down in Baton Rouge. And it's the first time he's been in the Deep South. It's the first time he's been in a Jim Crow society. Where he and Muriel live in Baton Rouge is about a mile and a half from the LSU campus. Every day when he goes back and forth, he passes through the primary Black neighborhood of Baton Rouge. He and Muriel have a Black housekeeper whom they get to know. And this is just a series of terrible revelations for Humphrey. It goes way beyond the things that are our standard images of a segregated society, which of course existed. The water fountains, the bathrooms, the back of the bus. He sees all that, but also what stays with him are these kind of piercingly personal encounters. To see a Black pedestrian cursed out by a white motorist who thinks the pedestrian is taking too long to cross the street. To see Black people in the lobby of the state capitol afraid to get on an elevator if any white people are in it. To have the family housekeeper talk about the terror in the Black neighborhood when the white bill collectors would come into the neighborhood. That stays with Humphrey for the rest of his life. And the other thing that's really surprising, because you would expect a big Black population in Baton Rouge, you wouldn't expect him to run into many Jews, but he actually has the first important contact with Jews in his life there. And he's on the debating team while he's a grad student. And one of his classmates, a guy who later becomes a federal judge, very liberal, pro-civil rights federal judge named Alvin Rubin. Rubin has a bunch of uncles who were trapped in Europe in the maw of what will become the Nazi final solution. And this is the beginning of Humphrey hearing firsthand stories from Jewish people about both anti-Semitism in this country, but also about the personal familial toll of the Nazi dominion in Europe. And that affects him. And then the last thing is that Humphrey has this professor named Rudolph Eberle, who I think changes Humphrey's life. Eberle is an exiled, 1/8 Jewish anti-Nazi professor who's kicked out of Nazi Germany because he'd begun to study how is it that a democratic society, i.e. Weimar Germany, could in a matter of 2 years elect a Nazi as chancellor, as Germany did. And the seminar he teaches that Humphrey takes that whole year he's in grad school is built around Eberle's research on that subject. And the key thing is when his year of getting his master's degree there is over and he heads back north, you might think he would take away, and this is something a lot of purported liberals in Minneapolis at this time would say, well, the South is terrible, but it's different here.
Yeah.
Right.
Humphrey can see that, to put it in the term that I'm sure Kellie knows, that there's down south and there's up south.
Yeah, yeah.
And he realizes that Minneapolis is up south. And he realizes that there's de jure segregation, but there's also de facto segregation. Mm-hmm. And that's going to inform everything he does subsequently in Minneapolis and then ultimately nationally.
Wow. That's great.
I'm curious then about Hubert Humphrey, who we all know, where we encounter him in the story of American history, which by and large is in 1968, right? He's LBJ's vice president. Johnson decides in March of 68 not to run for re-election. And Humphrey emerges in that moment, at least in the common telling. You know, you have this very charismatic Bobby Kennedy, you have Eugene McCarthy,
right,
and the anti-war Democrats. And Humphrey is sort of often portrayed as a weak establishment figure. He's not this, firebrand. He's not this leading edge kind of guy. Do we just get the Humphrey of 68 wrong?
No,
or
does
something happen that changes
Niki,
him?
your portrayal of Humphrey in 68 is certainly not only what my research confirms, but what I remember. I was 13 years old in 1968. My parents were Gene McCarthy supporters in the anti-war movement. I sat there watching on TV the police riot at the Chicago convention, and the fact that Humphrey had the nomination delivered to him by machine people like Mayor Daley, and that he received it as anti-war protesters and journalists were being battered senseless by the Chicago cops. That just seemed to cap a view of Humphrey as a traitor to his own best principles, as the person who had supported the Vietnam War loyally, as the person who gets this nomination handed to him by the machine only really because Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. And so, of course, that was an image that really stuck. And what added to it in later campaigns by Humphrey, particularly 1972, when he lost the nomination to George McGovern, was this kind of frenetic quality of his campaigning, this desperation that made Hunter Thompson, the self-described gonzo journalist, infamously say that Humphrey was campaigning like a rat in heat. And that was the image that people in my generation, and I think my parents' generation, adhered to with Humphrey. And it's not a false one, but it had been preceded by this incredibly valiant man. And one of the things that frustrated me and really compelled me to do the book is that we understand that the LBJ of the bloody, horrible mistake of Vietnam escalation was also Lyndon Johnson, who courageously pushed through civil rights and Great Society legislation. And you have to hold both Johnsons in a dynamic dialectic relationship if you look at him as a historian or a biographer or an informed citizen. And I kept wondering, why hasn't Humphrey received the same 360-degree assessment? Why do we forget the other part, particularly since he was active on civil rights starting in the early 1940s, a good 15 years before Lyndon Johnson really took his first big public stand with the 1957 Civil Rights Bill that he pushed through the Senate. And I wanted to sort of recover that person, not to exculpate the other one, because you have to face that truth. And Humphrey needed to face that truth and how he was viewed by people around him. That's the sad reality of life. We are who we are. But to give a sense of the totality of the man.
Wow.
All right. Well, hopefully, listeners, you get a sense there is so much in this book. It is Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. Samuel Freedman of Columbia and many other things. Thanks for doing this. I know this is your main thing, 8 years in the making, but anything else you're up to that you want people to know about?
No, I'm very happy to have this book out and being able to talk about it. People can find me on the web, and there's information about where I'll be speaking. And please don't use my Twitter account. I got hacked. And,
Oh no!
Yep. And of course, would Elon Musk let system support help me get back on? No. But maybe I'm just.
That's awful. I'm
so
sorry.
find me on. So you can find me on Facebook. So.
Yeah, or just get off Twitter and read an actual book.
Read a book. Read a book. If you send me an email after reading a book, I promise you a personal response.
There you go.
Yay.
Well, thanks to you. And as always, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.